The first bullet shattered the silence of dawn like breaking glass, its echo bouncing off the sandstone cliffs of Devil's Canyon before dying in the desert wind. The Nashoba pressed himself against the weathered stone, his Spencer carbine ready, as boot hauls thundered past his hiding spot among the scattered boulders. Below in the canyon floor, a young woman ran barefoot across the rocky ground. 3 gray wolves flowing alongside her like smoke given form. She wasn't fleeing randomly. Every step showed purpose. Every glance revealed someone who knew this terrain intimately. Her buckskin dress patched with scraps of different hides marked her as someone who'd learned to survive on salvage and cunning. The wolves weren't chasing her. They moved as her scouts, ranging ahead to test for danger before circling back to her position. Another shot cracked overhead, closer this time. The hunters were gaining ground. Nashoba counted 6 riders spread across the canyon rim, and their horses dancing nervously at the cliff edge while their masters searched for clean shots at the running figure below. Seasoned trackers by their spacing and discipline. The kind who got paid for results, not mercy. Something about their leader's posture stirred an uneasy familiarity. The way he sat his horse with unconscious grace, reading the terrain, with eyes that seemed to know every shadow and crevice. The woman stumbled, went down hard on loose shale, and for a heartbeat the wolves surrounded her in a protective circle. That hesitation cost her precious distance as the riders found a switchback trail leading down into the canyon. Without conscious decision, Nashoba stepped from cover. His carbine barked once the heavy .56 caliber bullets spanging off rock inches from the lead rider's horse. The animal reared, nearly pitching its rider into the abyss, and the pursuit faltered as men fought to control panicked mounts. "This way," he called to the woman, indicating a narrow defile that would take them deeper into the maze of canyons. She looked up at him, dark eyes in a sun-darkened face, intelligent and wary. For a second he thought she might refuse his help, choosing the devil she knew over the stranger she didn't. Then another bullet chipped stone near her head, and pragmatism won over caution. The wolves reached his position, first yellow eyes evaluating him with predator intensity. The largest male showed his teeth in warning, but when the woman whistled softly a sound that reminded Nashoba of Apache hunting calls from his childhood, they fell back to flanking positions that kept her between them and this new human. "Can you climb?" Nashoba asked as they ran. "Better than they can," she replied, breathing hard but steady. Behind them, angry voices echoed off canyon walls as the riders discovered their quarry had found an ally. The sound of hoof-beats changed pitch as horses were pushed faster down treacherous trails, iron shoes ringing against stone in a deadly rhythm. But there was something else. A whistle, low and piercing, that made Nashoba's blood chill with half-remembered dread. It was a signal he'd heard before in another life. When Apache raiders coordinated attacks across impossible terrain, they climbed through morning shadows, following deer paths and ledges that would challenge a mountain goat. The woman moved with surprising grace for someone fleeing for her life, finding handholds where none seemed to exist. The wolves bounded from ledge to ledge with casual ease, their pads silent on stone that clicked and scraped under human boots. "What did you steal?" Nashoba asked during a brief rest, his eyes still searching the canyon below for signs of pursuit. "Nothing that wasn't mine by right," she replied, patting a leather satchel at her side. "But they killed my father for it 3 weeks ago. I'm Elise Whitmore." The name carried weight in territorial circles. Thomas Whitmore had been the government surveyor whose mysterious death had stirred whispers in trading posts and territorial offices. His surveys had been meticulous, his integrity unquestioned, until someone decided both had become inconvenient. Nashoba, he offered in return, then caught himself using the Apache name that marked him as different in a territory where such differences could be fatal. "Wolf," she translated, surprising him. "Your father taught you the old language." "My grandfather," he corrected, then wondered why he'd shared even that much with a stranger. There was something about her directness that invited trust despite the circumstances that had thrown them together. A rifle cracked below them, the bullet striking sparks from stone where they'd stood moments before. Their pursuers had dismounted and were following on foot, moving with the persistence of men who knew their prey was trapped in the canyon system. The leader technique was unmistakable now, reading sign like a born tracker, anticipating their route with skills that seemed almost supernatural. Higher ground. Noah decided, fighting down the growing unease that told him this pursuit was more personal than professional. "Force them to come up after us, where we can control the engagement." She nodded, understanding. This was clearly a woman who'd learned tactics the hard way through trial and error in circumstances where mistakes meant death. They climbed toward the rim, muscles burning and lungs working hard in the thin air. Behind them, their hunters closed the distance, steadily, showing patience that spoke of men who knew their prey was trapped and time was on their side. The canyon system was vast and complex, carved by centuries of flash floods into a labyrinth that could hide an army or trap the unwary forever. But it was also neutral ground, dangerous to hunter and hunted alike, where survival depended on knowledge, endurance, and the kind of desperate cunning that came from having nothing left to lose. As they crested the rim, Nashoba got his first clear look at their pursuers. 6 men in dusty trail clothes, armed with rifles and revolvers, moving with military precision. Former cavalrymen by their bearing and coordination. The kind of hired guns who worked for cattle barons and territorial politicians when the job required more than legal intimidation. But it was their leader who held his attention, a tall, lean figure whose fluid movement spoke of someone raised in Apache camps before civilization claimed him. The man paused to examine their trail, and something in his posture triggered a memory so sharp it stole Noba's breath. A child's laughter around a winter fire, small hands weaving grass into toy animals. A voice calling his name across a meadow that no longer existed. "Who wants you dead?" he asked, forcing himself to focus on immediate threats rather than ghosts from the past. "Montgomery Hale," she replied the name, carrying enough venom to kill snakes and everyone who works for him. Nashoba knew the name, a cattle baron, with holdings scattered across 3 territories, known for acquiring land through methods that skirted the edge of legality. If Hale wanted this woman dead, she'd found evidence of something that could destroy him. The question was whether 2 people and 3 wolves could survive long enough to use that evidence against enemies with unlimited resources and no scruples about murder. The abandoned settlement of Copper Falls stretched along a dry riverbed like bones bleaching in the desert sun. Once a thriving mining camp during the silver boom of the 50s, it had been gutted by played-out veins and Apache raids until only empty buildings remained. Now it served as shelter for drifters, outlaws, and anyone else seeking to disappear from territorial law. The Shoba had been using one of the more intact cabins as a base while hunting the high country for pelts and meat. At 34, he carried himself with the efficient movements of a man who'd spent years as an army scout, reading sign and staying alive in hostile territory. His Mescalero Apache heritage showed in his ability to move silently and find water in country that killed white men through thirst. But his service with the territorial forces had given him knowledge of military tactics and weapons that made him valuable to both sides in the ongoing conflicts. More importantly, this region held personal significance. 5 miles downstream, marked by a circle of painted stones, lay his younger brother's grave. Takakota had died 2 years ago in a skirmish with rustlers cut down while protecting a supply wagon, or so the official reports claimed. Nashoba visited the site whenever his wanderings brought him through the area, leaving traditional offerings and maintaining the marker against weather and scavengers. But lately, something had been troubling him about those reports, inconsistencies in the witness statements, details that didn't match the physical evidence he'd found at the site. "I'm sorry about earlier," Elise said as they rested in the shade of a collapsed mine headframe. "About using your Apache name like that. My father spent years working with tribal representatives on land surveys. He taught me that names carry power, and using them without permission shows disrespect." The apology was unexpected and thoughtful, revealing education that went deeper than simple book learning. "Most people don't understand that." The Showa replied, "Your father sounds like he was an honest man. He was maybe too honest for this territory." She opened the leather satchel and withdrew a thick notebook filled with careful handwriting and detailed maps. He'd been documenting irregularities in territorial land records for months before they killed him. The Shoba examined the notebook, his army experience, helping him interpret the surveyor's technical notations. What he saw made his jaw tighten. Systematic fraud on a massive scale. Legitimate homestead claims invalidated through forged documents, water rights transferred to front companies under borrowed names, and vast tracts of public land sold to private interests at prices that suggested extensive bribery. "Montgomery Hale," he said, seeing the cattle baron's name appear repeatedly in the records. "He's been buying politicians and judges throughout the territory." Papa documented payments, forged signatures, even witness testimony from people who watched legitimate settlers get driven off their land by hired guns. Her voice carried the controlled anger of someone who'd learned to channel grief into purpose. The scope is staggering. Millions of acres stolen through legal manipulation, backed by violence. The documentation was professional and thorough, the work of a man who understood that accusations of conspiracy required unshakable proof. But it was the personal notes in the margins that revealed the true cost of Whitmore's investigation. References to threats against his family, attempts to bribe or intimidate him, and growing fear that his work would die with him. "Why hasn't this been reported to federal authorities?" Elisa's bitter laugh carried no humor. "Papa tried. The territorial governor's office sent his reports back marked insufficient evidence. The federal marshal claimed jurisdiction issues prevented investigation. Every official channel led back to people on Hale's payroll. It was a depressingly familiar story. Territorial governments were notoriously corrupt, their officials often more loyal to wealthy benefactors than to federal law. Justice, when it existed at all, came through informal channels and private action rather than official courts. "The wolves," Nashoba said, changing the subject as the three gray shapes settled in the shade nearby. "How long have they been with you?" "Almost 2 years. Started when I was living rough. After Papa's first attempts to expose the corruption brought threats, she pulled strips of dried meat from her pack and distributed them to the animals who accepted the food with casual familiarity. An injured female wandered into my camp, starving and limping from a trap wound. I shared my food and treated her injury, and eventually she brought her maid and offspring. She whistled softly that same hunting call that had stirred something in Nashoba's memory. And the largest wolf raised his head attentively, not submission, but acknowledgement between equalsmen. They're not tame," she continued. "They hunt on their own, maintain their pack structure, and make their own decisions about when to help me. But we share information and resources in ways that keep all of us alive in country that would kill us individually." It was a pragmatic arrangement that Nashoba respected, reminiscent of the old Apache way of forming alliances with the natural world rather than trying to dominate it. As he watched the interaction between woman and wolves, he found himself studying her more closely and the unconscious grace of her movements, the way she read the animal's body language. The quiet confidence that suggested someone comfortable with solitude and self-reliance. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their rest. Their pursuers had followed their trail to Copper Falls and were systematically searching the abandoned buildings. Disciplined hunters who wouldn't be deterred by terrain or time, following orders that probably included significant bonuses for success. 6 men, Nashoba observed, counting the distinct hoof patterns. Well armed and organized. They'll find us eventually if we stay here. Then we don't stay, Elise replied, already gathering her gear. There's a network of mine shafts and tunnels throughout these hills. We can lose them underground and emerge miles from here. As they prepared to descend into the largest mine entrance, Noba caught sight of their leader again, a figure who moved with predatory patience, examining their abandoned campsite with professional thoroughness. The man paused to study something in the dust, and his posture triggered another flash of memory. A boy crouched by a stream reading tracts with the same intense concentration. Small hands pointing out sign that adult eyes had missed. The wolves were reluctant to enter the mine, their wild instincts rebelling against the enclosed environment. But they followed their human partner into the alien world of worked stone and timber supports. The darkness was absolute beyond the entrance, filled with the scent of minerals and decay. And Shoba lit a small torch, conserving their limited supply of matches while providing enough light to navigate safely. The main tunnel branched repeatedly, following ore veins that had been extracted generations ago by men desperate enough to work in conditions that killed more miners than cave-ins or explosions. This connects to the Bonanza mine 2 miles east, Elise explained, consulting a hand-drawn map. From there, we can reach the high meadows where Ricardo Martinez runs cattle. Ricardo Martinez, another name that carried weight in the territory. One of the few honest ranchers who treated Apache bands fairly and stood up to intimidation from larger operators. If they could reach his ranch, they'd find temporary sanctuary and possibly allies in their fight against Hale's conspiracy. But first, they had to survive the underground maze that separated them from safety. Behind them, torchlight flickered in the mine entrance as their pursuers began their own descent into the darkness. The Bonanza mine had been abandoned so long that bats roosted in its deeper passages, their droppings creating a choking atmosphere that burned the lungs and obscured vision. And Shoba led the way with his torch held low, reading the subtle air currents that indicated safe passage versus dangerous dead ends. The tunnel system was more complex than Elisa's map indicated. Decades of mining had created a 3-dimensional maze where passages intersected at multiple levels, connected by vertical shafts and inclined drifts that could drop a careless explorer into flooded sumps or unstable rubble piles. "Stop," Nashoba whispered. Raising his hand, his froze, listening to sounds that filtered through the stone voices, distant but growing closer. Their pursuers had split up, sending men through multiple tunnels to cut off escape routes, experienced tactics that spoke of military training and careful planning. "This way," Elise breathed, indicating a narrow side passage that angled upward toward what might be another entrance. They squeezed through the constricted space, the torch flame guttering dangerously in the thin air. The wolves whined softly, their wild instincts rebelling against the enclosed environment. But they followed their human companions deeper into the honeycombed hillside. The passage opened into a natural cavern where underground water had carved fantastic formations from living rock. Stalactites hung like stone icicles, while flowstone deposits created terrace pools that reflected their torchlight in jeweled patterns. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. "Dead end," Nashoba announced, examining the cavern walls for any sign of continuing passage. "Not necessarily," Elise replied, pointing toward the sound of running water. Papa mapped several underground streams in this area. If we follow the water, it has to emerge somewhere. They followed the stream through increasingly narrow passages, the torch finally guttering out entirely as oxygen levels dropped to barely sustainable levels. Now they moved by touch and sound, following the water's flow through absolute darkness, while trying not to think about the tons of rock suspended above their heads. Gunshots echoed through the mine system behind them. Whether accidental discharges or attempts to intimidate their quarry, the sound served as reminders that pursuit was still active and determined. But there was something else mixed with the gunfire. A voice calling orders in a language that made Nashoba's heart skip. Apache words spoken with the accent of someone who'd learned them as a child. "Light ahead," Elise whispered. They emerged into afternoon sunlight on a hillside meadow dotted with grazing cattle. The Martinez Ranch stretched below them, a modest but prosperous spread that showed the results of honest labor and careful management. Smoke rose from the ranch house chimney, promising warmth food and temporary safety. But their relief was short-lived. Even as they stood blinking in the sunlight, the distinctive crack of rifle fire echoed from the mine entrance they just vacated. Their pursuers were still coming, following their trail with the persistence of seasoned trackers. Ricardo Elise called toward the ranch buildings. A figure emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, but not immediately threatening. Ricardo Martinez was a compact man in his 40s, with the weathered features and careful movements of someone who'd survived decades of frontier ranching. He recognized Elise immediately, his expression shifting from weariness to concern. "Nah, what brings you here running like bandits chase you?" "Because bandits are chasing us," she replied quickly, explaining their situation while Nashoba kept watch on the mine entrance. Ricardo's face darkened as he heard about the corruption documented in Whitmore's survey records. Like most honest ranchers, he'd felt the pressure of Hale's expansion, but lacked the resources to fight back effectively. Movement at the mine entrance interrupted their planning. 3 men emerged into the sunlight, rifles ready, and eyes scanning the meadow for signs of their quarry. But it was the 4th figure that made Nashoba's world tilt on its axis. Tall and lean, moving with the fluid grace of someone raised in Apache camps, the man carried himself with authority that marked him as the leader. But it was his face weathered by sun and wind, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw that stopped Nashoba's breath in his throat. A boy's face aged by 24 years of hard living. The same cheekbones, the same intelligent eyes, the same unconscious gesture of brushing hair back from his forehead when concentrating. But where the child had carried joy and curiosity, the man showed only cold purpose and carefully controlled violence. Lakota, his little brother supposedly dead these 2 years, very much alive and leading the men who wanted to kill them. "Get to the house," Ricardo ordered, already moving toward defensive positions among the ranch buildings. "I'll hold them here." But Nashoba was studying the tactical situation with military eyes that saw past the shock of recognition. 4 men with rifles against 3 defenders and a rancher with open ground offering minimal concealment. Not impossible odds, but far from favorable. "No," he managed, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We run. Fighting here gets people killed who don't deserve it." They reached the horse corral as the first shot shattered the afternoon calm. The bullet sparked off a fence post inches from Noba's head, close enough to spray him with splinters. He rolled behind a water trough as more shots followed his mind, reeling with the impossibility of what he'd seen. Lakota was alive. Lakota was hunting them. Lakota had become everything their grandfather had warned against when he spoke of Apache, who forgot their people and served their enemies. "Horses," Elise called, already working to calm the animals while bullets winded overhead. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Ricardo's disciplined return fire forced the attackers to seek cover, while his wife Maria provided support from the ranch house windows. But the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as superior numbers began to tell. They mounted up as the gunfire intensified, Ricardo making his own tactical decision to abandon his defensive position and sprint toward his house while his wife provided covering fire. "Ride!" he shouted. "I'll follow when I can." Nashoba and Elise spurred their horses toward the high country, following cattle trails that would take them away from the ranch and deeper into the wilderness. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued as Ricardo and Maria defended their home against men who served a system that considered their lives expendable. But as they climbed toward the Triine, Noba couldn't shake the image of his brother's face, cold, professional, utterly committed to their destruction. Whatever had happened to transform the laughing child into this merciless hunter, it had completed a betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet wound. The high country above Martinez Ranch offered concealment but little comfort. Ancient pines clung to rocky slopes where winter storms had sculpted the landscape into a maze of ridges and ravines, while scattered meadows provided grazing for wildlife that had learned to avoid human contact. They rode through the afternoon following game trails that would be difficult to track, but also slow their progress toward civilization. The horses were sturdy ranch stock bred for mountain work, but they carried double loads and couldn't maintain a fast pace indefinitely. "There's a way station at Willow Creek," Elise said, consulting a mental map of the territory. Old stage line relay cabins still kept as a mail and freight stop by a private contractor under a federal mail route. "If we can reach it, we might find federal marshals or other law enforcement." It was thin hope, but better than wandering the wilderness while their enemies organized systematic pursuit. As they climbed higher, Nashoba found himself studying their back trail with growing unease. The techniques being used to follow them weren't those of ordinary hired guns, and they showed the kind of intuitive understanding of Apache movement patterns that could only come from someone raised in the culture. The wolves had reappeared as they climbed into the high country, ranging ahead and behind their small group with tireless efficiency. Their presence was both reassuring and dangerous. They could provide early warning of approaching threats, but they also made the party easier to track for anyone who knew what signs to read. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered canyon where a spring provided water and concealment from observation. No fire smoke would be visible for miles in the clear mountain air, but they shared food and rested while the horses grazed on mountain grass. "Tell me about your father," Nashoba said, needing distraction from thoughts of his brother's transformation. Elise's expression softened with memory and grief. He was a dreamer who believed the law should protect everyone equally regardless of wealth or influence. Spent his career documenting territorial resources for federal development, always hoping his work would help create honest communities instead of more opportunities for exploitation. She opened the survey notebook, its pages filled with careful observations accumulated over months of investigation. These represent his last attempt to expose systematic corruption before it destroyed everything he'd worked for. He died believing his documentation would make a difference. The records showed a pattern of systematic resource extraction that extended far beyond simple cattle ranching. Silver, copper, and gold deposits were being claimed through forged documents and bribed officials, while legitimate miners were driven off their claims by violence and legal manipulation. "This is worth millions," Nashoba realized studying the geological surveys that accompanied the land documentation, enough to buy statehood and establish a political dynasty that would control territorial development for generations. Elise confirmed. "Papa calculated that Hale's network controls over 2 million acres of fraudulently obtained land plus mineral rights worth more than the territorial government's entire annual budget. A wolf's low growl interrupted their conversation. The animals had gone rigid with attention, ears forward and nostrils testing the night wind. Danger was approaching, though, whether human or natural remained unclear. Noba motioned for silence while he listened to the sounds of the mountain night. Then underlying the natural soundtrack came the faint of metal on stone that marked the passage of shod hooves on rocky ground, riders moving carefully through the darkness. At least 4 horses, probably more following their trail with the persistence of experienced trackers. Their lead had evaporated faster than expected, suggesting their enemies had resources and local knowledge that exceeded his estimates. They broke camp, silently, loading essential gear while leaving behind anything that would slow their escape. The horses sensed urgency and moved restlessly, but years of ranch training kept them manageable, even in stressful circumstances. Dawn found them descending toward a broad valley, where the Willow Creek Way Station sat like a lonely outpost of civilization. Smoke rose from its chimney, indicating active occupation, while corral and outudings suggested it still served its original function as a stopping point for official travelers. But as they approached, details became visible that transformed hope into apprehension. Too many horses in the corral, and men posted as sentries in positions that commanded approaches to the station. It's a trap, Nashoba concluded, studying the tactical situation from a concealed position in the treine. Elise used her father's surveying telescope to examine the station more closely. "I recognize 2 of them," she said grimly. "Hale's men. They got here before us." The realization hit both of them simultaneously, and their enemies weren't just following their trail. They were anticipating their moves. Someone with detailed knowledge of the territory and federal facilities was directing the pursuit. Someone who understood how fugitives would think and where they would seek help. "We're being herded," Noba said, the tactical pattern becoming clear, driven toward destinations they control. It was a sobering assessment. Every move they made was being predicted and countered by an opponent who held strategic advantages and seemed to know their thinking better than they knew themselves. The sound of approaching horses ended their reconnaissance. Their night-long pursuit had caught up with them, just as they discovered their planned sanctuary was compromised. 3 directions offered capture or death, while the 4th led deeper into wilderness that would test their survival skills against approaching winter weather. "The high peaks," Elise decided, pointing toward mountains that rose into morning clouds. "There are old mining camps up there, abandoned, but with shelters that might keep us alive until we can find another way out." It meant abandoning their horses. The terrain ahead was too steep and rocky for mounted travel. They stripped essential gear from their saddles, while the wolves waited with predator patience for the next phase of their desperate journey. The abandoned silver camp of Eagle's Roost, perched on a narrow ledge 2,000 ft above the valley floor, its remaining buildings clinging to the mountainside like weathered bones. The climb had tested both their endurance and their equipment, forcing them to cache non-essential gear and rely on skill rather than supplies to overcome natural obstacles. They established camp in a building that offered multiple escape routes and good fields of fire, choosing structure over comfort as they prepared for what might be their final stand. The altitude made every task more difficult, but it also created challenges for anyone attempting to approach the camp undetected. As they settled for the night, Elise opened her father's notebook to a section that revealed the full scope of Hale's ambitions, detailed maps of territorial water rights and mineral claims that showed systematic acquisition of resources across millions of acres. "It's not just land," she explained, pointing to areas marked with cryptic notations. "Papa discovered that Hale has been filing fraudulent mining claims throughout the territory using front companies under borrowed names, to avoid legal limits on individual holdings. The conspiracy was vast enough to reshape territorial development positioning. Hale to control water rights, transportation routes, and mineral resources that would make him powerful enough to influence statehood proceedings directly. A sound from outside their shelter interrupted the conversation. Not wind or settling timber, but the deliberate scrape of boot leather against stone. They froze weapons ready, while the wolves melted into defensive positions around the building's perimeter. "We know you're here," a voice called across the empty space between buildings. The accent was educated, carrying calm authority that marked career military training. "Saw your trail coming up the ridge. No point making this harder than it needs to be." But it wasn't the leader speaking. That voice, when it came, carried different weight entirely. "Sister, you're fighting the wrong war." The words were Apache spoken with the accent of someone who'd learned them as a mother tongue. "Come out and we'll talk like family should." Nashoba's blood turned to ice. Not only was his brother alive and hunting them, but he was using the old language, the sacred words their grandfather had taught them around winter fires, when the world was different and hope still seemed possible. "Counteroffer," Nashoba called back in the same language. "You remember who you used to be, and we won't have to kill you." The silence that followed was profound, broken finally by bitter laughter that carried no warmth. "I remember everything, older brother, including how you let them take me away when I was 10 years old." The accusation hit like a physical blow, stirring guilt that Nashoba had carried for over 20 years. The winter when starvation had forced impossible choices on desperate families. The traders who'd offered food in exchange for children who could pass for Mexican orphans. The agonizing decision to let Lakota go rather than watch him starve with the rest of them. "I thought you were dead," Nashoba replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of grief. "Dead would have been kinder. Do you know what they did to Apache children in their schools? How they beat the language out of us, the culture out of us, the very memory of who we used to be?" The pain in those words cut deeper than anger would have, revealing wounds that had never healed despite the years that had passed. But it also revealed something else. This wasn't just about following orders or earning pay. This was personal, driven by resentment that had festered for more than 2 decades. The firefight that followed was brief, but intense. Nashoba's Spencer carbine provided long-range accuracy that forced the attackers to seek better cover, while Elise's weapons were effective at shorter ranges when enemies attempted to close distance. But ammunition was limited, and their enemies showed no signs of withdrawing. This was siege warfare that would end in starvation or successful assault unless the tactical situation changed dramatically. That change came from the wolves responding to threats against their human partners with systematic harassment of the attackers from positions that were invisible to human observers. A sentry vanished with only a brief cry of surprise. Another man screamed as powerful jaws closed on his weapon arm, disarming him and sending him fleeing down the mountainside. The effect on their nerves was immediate and devastating. Disciplined soldiers could face human enemies with trained courage, but attacks by invisible predators triggered primal fears that military training couldn't entirely suppress. "What the hell was that?" Voices called in the darkness. The siege collapsed as fear overcame discipline. 2 men fled outright, abandoning their positions to scramble down treacherous slopes in the darkness. The remaining attackers consolidated around their leader, but even professional resolve had its limits when facing enemies that hunted like ghosts. "This isn't over," the familiar voice called toward their position. "Hale's got resources you can't imagine, and he'll keep sending men until you're dead, or that notebook is destroyed." "Tell Hale he's welcome to come collect it personally," Elise replied. The final exchange of gunfire was anticlimactic. A few shots to cover the attackers' withdrawal, followed by the sound of horses departing at dangerous speed down mountain trails. Within minutes, Eagle's Roost had returned to its natural silence. But victory was temporary and costly. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Their position was known to their enemies, and winter weather was moving in with storm systems that could trap unwary travelers for weeks. "We can't stay here," Nashoba concluded, examining their remaining supplies. "And we can't keep running indefinitely," Elise replied. "Every place we go, they're already waiting, or they follow us there. We need to change the game." She was right. Reactive flight was a losing strategy against enemies with superior resources and territorial knowledge. Survival required shifting from defense to offense, using their mobility and inside knowledge to strike back at the conspiracy that wanted them dead. But first, they needed allies, and Noba knew where to find them. The storm that had been threatening since dawn finally broke as they descended toward the hidden valley that held Ricardo Martinez's line camp. Snow mixed with freezing rain created conditions that turned every step into a potential disaster, while visibility dropped to mere yards through the swirling precipitation. The line camp appeared through the storm like salvation, a modest cabin with attached corral where Martinez kept supplies for winter feeding operations. Smoke rising from the chimney indicated recent occupation, offering the promise of warmth and safety that they desperately needed. But as they stumbled through the door into blessed warmth, and they found more than simple refuge. Dr. Henry Cobb sat at the rough-hewn table, his medical bag open beside papers covered with careful handwriting. Helen Martinez, Ricardo's sister, was preparing food while keeping watch through the single window. "Thank God," Dr. Cobb said, rising to examine them for signs of frostbite or exposure. "We'd begun to fear the worst when the storm caught you in the high country." As they warmed themselves by the fire, Ricardo explained how news of their flight had spread throughout the Territo's network of honest settlers and ranchers. Dr. Cobb had been treating wounded survivors of attacks on small homesteads, while Helen had been documenting testimonies from families driven off their land by Hale's organization. "It's worse than even your father knew," Dr. Cobb said, opening his own notebook filled with medical records and witness statements. "Systematic violence against anyone who questions Hale's expansion. Families murdered homesteads, burned children orphaned or worse." But Helen's next revelation transformed their understanding of the conspiracy in ways that made victory seem impossible rather than merely difficult. "We found out who's been coordinating the pursuit," she said, her voice carrying reluctance to share information that would cause pain. She opened a leather portfolio filled with military correspondence and personnel records. David Rowan, also known as Dark Dave, former Army scout, discharged under suspicious circumstances 5 years ago. The name hit Noba like a physical blow, confirming what he'd already suspected, but hoped wasn't true. Not David Rowan Takakota and Nashoba, his younger half-brother, the child he'd thought dead for more than 20 years. "He's Apache." Helen continued consulting the military records. Mixed blood, raised in traditional camps, until his family was scattered during the reservation relocations. The Army recruited him as a scout because of his cultural knowledge and tracking skills. "His mother's name?" Nashoba asked quietly, though he already knew what the answer would be. Ayana Rowan Nashoba died during the winter of 1851. Malnutrition complicated by pneumonia. The same winter when 10-year-old Takakota had been traded to Mexican slavers to save him from starving with the rest of their scattered band. The same winter when Nashoba had made the hardest decision of his life, choosing his brother's survival over keeping their family together. "You know him," Elise said, reading the recognition and pain in his expression. "He's my brother," Nashoba replied, the words coming out like broken glass. "My younger half-brother, who was supposed to be dead." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the storm wind against the cabin walls and the crackling of the fire. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Their most dangerous enemy wasn't just a skilled tracker, but someone who shared Noba's blood and knew his thinking patterns with intimate precision. That's why they've been anticipating our moves. Dr. Cobb realized he knows how you think, where you'd go, who you'd trust for help. It was worse than that. Takakota would know Apache traditions about family obligation and blood loyalty cultural values that might prevent Nashoba from taking decisive action when confrontation became inevitable. "There's more," Helen said reluctantly. "The military records show he was discharged for excessive violence during operations against Apache bands. Specifically, he was involved in attacks on camps that included members of his own extended family. The betrayal went deeper than simple employment by enemies. Takakota had become an active participant in the destruction of their people, using his cultural knowledge to make that destruction more efficient and complete." Through the window, the storm showed no signs of abating. They were trapped in the cabin until the weather cleared. But that isolation also protected them from immediate pursuit. "We make our stand here," Nashoba decided, forcing himself to think tactically rather than emotionally. "Use the storm as cover to prepare defensive positions, then force them to come to us on ground. We've chosen." It was a dangerous strategy that accepted open confrontation rather than continued flight. But running had become futile against enemies who could predict their movements, and their ammunition and supplies were too depleted for extended wilderness survival. "Takakota will come." He continued using his brother's real name for the first time since learning he was alive. "He knows this country, and he'll know where we'd seek shelter during a storm like this. When the weather clears, he'll be here with enough men to finish this permanently." But as they prepared defensive positions throughout the night, Nashoba found his attention drawn repeatedly to Elise. The way she moved with quiet efficiency, checking weapons and calculating fields of fire, the competent manner in which she coordinated with the wolves, using their superior senses to establish early warning systems around the cabin. More than that, he found himself noting small details that had nothing to do with their tactical situation. The graceful line of her neck as she bent over her father's notebook. The unconscious habit she had of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating. The way her eyes lit up when she caught him watching her, suggesting awareness that mirrored his own growing feelings. "You should try to sleep," she said during a brief lull in their preparations. "You'll need your strength tomorrow." Instead of sleeping, he found himself talking to her in low tones while the others rested about his childhood in the camps, the hardships that had scattered his family, the guilt he'd carried for decades over choices that had seemed necessary at the time. "You saved his life," she said simply when he finished explaining about Takakota. "A 10-year-old boy couldn't have survived that winter with your band. You gave him a chance at a future, even if it wasn't the future either of you would have chosen." Her understanding was a gift. He hadn't expected absolution from someone whose own father had been murdered by the system his brother now served. As dawn approached and they prepared for what might be their final battle, Nashoba realized that somewhere between their first desperate flight and this moment of quiet conversation, his motivation had changed. He was no longer fighting just to survive or to expose Hale's conspiracy. He was fighting to protect the woman who'd become more important to him than his own life. The storm cleared before dawn, leaving the mountain valley transformed by 2 ft of fresh snow that sparkled like diamond dust in the early sunlight. The beauty of the landscape was deceptive beneath the pristine surface. Lay conditions that would challenge even experienced winter travelers. Nashoba had spent the sleepless night preparing defensive positions around the cabin, using the storm as cover to dig, firing positions and create obstacles that would channel any attack into predictable patterns. The wolves had remained active throughout the storm, and their superior senses detecting movement and changes that human perception missed. As dawn broke, Their behavior shifted to alert tension that indicated approaching danger. Through Ricardo's field glasses, Nashoba found them on the eastern ridge. 8 men moving carefully through the drifted snow, on their horses laboring through the deep powder, while the riders dismounted frequently to rest their mounts. But it was the tactical formation that confirmed his worst fears. Classic Apache war party movement adapted to winter conditions and mounted warfare. His brother was using traditional hunting patterns to coordinate the attack, turning their own cultural knowledge against them. The attack began with long-range rifle fire, designed to probe their defenses and identify defensive positions. But the shots were too carefully placed, too precisely aimed to force specific responses. Lakota was reading their defensive preparations like a familiar book, anticipating their responses with the intuitive understanding that came from shared cultural background. Nashoba returned fire with careful precision, but every shot revealed information that his brother could use to adjust tactics and counter their defensive advantages. They were fighting someone who'd learned warfare in the same school, who understood Apache tactical thinking better than any white military officer. The engagement settled into a deadly pattern of advance and response, with the attackers using coordinated movement to systematically reduce the defenders' options. But the wolves introduced chaos into carefully planned tactics, striking at isolated men who become separated from mutual support. The psychological effect was devastating, but Lakota adapted quickly. Instead of trying to maintain tight formations that were vulnerable to wolf attacks, he allowed his men to spread out and operate independently, using the broken terrain to approach from multiple angles simultaneously. "Something's wrong with this picture," Ricardo observed during a lull in the firing. Nashoba had noticed it too. The attack was proceeding according to conventional military doctrine rather than the innovative tactics he'd expected from someone with Lakota's background and cultural knowledge. "He's holding back." Nashoba realized this isn't his best effort. The revelation was both relieving and ominous. If Lakota wasn't committing fully to the assault, it meant he was either planning something more complex or struggling with the emotional implications of fighting his own brother. The answer came when rifle fire from a new direction suddenly erupted from the timber on the valley's northern slope. A second group of attackers had used the initial assault as a distraction while they moved into flanking positions. Classic pincer movement that would trap the defenders in crossfire. They couldn't survive. They gathered essential supplies and descended into the root cellar beneath the cabin's floor as bullets began striking the building from multiple directions. The underground space was cramped and dark, barely large enough for 5 people and 3 wolves, but it offered protection from rifle fire and a defendable position with limited approaches. Above them, the sound of boots on wooden floors indicated that the attackers had entered the cabin and were conducting systematic search. Professional thoroughness that would eventually discover their hiding place unless some kind of distraction interrupted the process. That distraction came when the wolves slipped out through the cellar entrance and disappeared into the snow-covered landscape. Whatever they'd sensed, their response would be swift and decisive. Gunfire erupted outside the cabin, but not the disciplined volleys of military engagement. These were panicked shots fired by men who couldn't see their targets and didn't understand what they were fighting. The situation above deteriorated rapidly as professional discipline crumbled under pressure from invisible enemies. The pack was conducting systematic harassment designed to break up the attackers' coordination and force them to respond to threats they couldn't predict or counter effectively. Within minutes, the sounds of retreat echoed across the valley as the attackers abandoned their positions and fled toward their horses. But Nashoba knew the victory was temporary. His brother would learn from this failure and adapt his tactics accordingly. They spent the remainder of the day moving through the high country, following routes that Nashoba hoped would be difficult to track. But knowing that Takakota's skills made true concealment nearly impossible, as they traveled, he found himself stealing glances at Elise, noting the determined set of her jaw, and the way she never complained despite the brutal conditions. During a brief rest, she caught him watching and moved closer, settling beside him with casual intimacy that suggested their relationship had crossed some invisible threshold during the night's shared danger. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I never expected to find someone worth fighting for in the middle of all this," he replied honestly. Her smile was radiant despite their desperate circumstances. "The feeling is mutual." It was a simple exchange, but it carried weight that went beyond mere attraction. They'd found each other in circumstances that stripped away social pretense and revealed essential character. Whatever happened in the coming confrontation, they would face it as partners in every sense of the word. The final confrontation took place at dawn in the ruins of the original Martinez homestead, where Ricardo's grandfather had first staked his claim 40 years earlier. The buildings had been burned during Apache raids in the 1850s, leaving only stone foundations and a few weathered walls to mark where dreams of prosperity had once flourished. Nashoba had chosen the location after careful consideration of tactical advantages and symbolic significance. The open ground around the ruins offered good fields of fire in all directions, while the scattered stone walls provided cover for defensive positions. More importantly, it was ground that held meaning, a place where different cultures had clashed and found accommodation, where the future of the territory would be decided by courage rather than conspiracy. They had perhaps an hour before full daylight would expose their positions to long-range rifle fire. Takakota's forces were approaching from 3 directions, using classic envelopment tactics that had proven effective during military campaigns. But this time, the intended victims understood the strategy and had prepared accordingly. Dr. Cobb positioned himself behind the thickest wall with medical supplies and ammunition, ready to treat wounds and provide supporting fire. Helen Martinez occupied a position that commanded the eastern approach, while Ricardo held the southern wall, where the main attack would likely develop. Elise and the wolves had taken positions among scattered boulders that dotted the area around the ruins, creating a mobile defense that could respond to threats from any direction. Her weapons weren't effective at long range, but they would be devastating in close combat if the attackers managed to reach the defensive perimeter. The Showa himself occupied the highest point among the ruins, where a partially collapsed chimney provided both cover and observation of the entire battlefield. His Spencer carbine was loaded with his last good cartridges, while his Colt Navy revolver remained holstered, but ready. The first shot came from the timberline to the north, a long-range attempt that struck sparks from stone near Helen's position. She responded immediately, her return fire accurate enough to force the sniper to seek better cover. More rifle fire erupted from multiple directions as the attackers revealed their positions through muzzle flashes and powder smoke. At least 12 men, possibly more, armed with military weapons and moving with coordinated precision. But the defenders had advantages that weren't immediately obvious to their enemies. The wolves were operating as independent scouts, providing intelligence about enemy movements, while conducting harassment attacks that disrupted coordination and communication. Movement on the south wall. Ricardo called firing at targets that appeared briefly in the morning light. Nashoba shifted his position to cover the threatened sector, his rifle cracking steadily as he engaged enemies advancing through broken ground toward the ruins. Each shot was carefully aimed, conserving ammunition while inflicting maximum damage on the attacking force. A figure emerged from the timber near the eastern wall, moving with fluid grace that spoke of someone who understood mountain combat intimately. Tall and lean with weathered features and the careful movements of a professional scout, he carried himself with an authority that marked him as the leader. Takakota had come to finish the work personally. He paused at the edge of effective rifle range, studying the defensive positions with professional assessment. Even across the distance, Nashoba could see the family resemblance, the same bone structure and movement patterns, the same intelligent evaluation of tactical challenges. Brother Takakota called, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "It doesn't have to end this way. Give us the notebook and the woman, and you can walk away from this." The offer was calculated to create doubt and encourage surrender, but it also revealed something important about Takakota's psychological state. He was still thinking of their relationship in terms of family obligation. Despite the choices that had put them on opposite sides, Irafer, Nashoba replied, "You remember who you used to be, and we can end this without more killing." Takakota's bitter laugh carried no humor. "I remember everything, including how you chose to save yourself instead of fighting for our family." The accusation cut deep, but Nashoba forced himself to respond with tactical thinking rather than emotional reaction. "I was 14 years old, and I made the best choice available. You're 44 now, and you're making choices that shame everything our grandfather taught us." The conversation was interrupted by renewed gunfire as the tactical situation continued to develop. More attackers were advancing on multiple fronts, using covering fire and movement techniques that spoke of professional military training. But the wolves had identified isolated enemies and were conducting systematic elimination of stragglers who became separated from their main force. Screams echoed across the battlefield as men disappeared into the broken ground, if their weapons falling silent one by one. "What kind of devils are you fighting with?" someone shouted from the attacking force. Takakota himself seemed immune to the fear that was spreading through his command. He advanced steadily through the defensive fire, using cover and concealment techniques that demonstrated expert fieldcraft. His approach was methodical and patient, the movement of someone who understood that victory required accepting calculated risks. The final phase of the battle began when Takakota reached effective range and opened fire with systematic precision. His shots were carefully aimed to force the defenders to keep their heads down while his remaining men advanced to assault positions. Nashoba found himself in direct combat with the brother he'd thought dead for 20 years. Their rifle duel conducted across broken ground with deadly stakes. Each shot required careful calculation of range, wind, and target movement. While the consequences of missing could be immediately fatal, you chose them over your own people. Nashoba called during a brief pause in the firing. "I chose survival over sentiment," Takakota responded. "The old ways are dead, brother. Smart men adapt to new realities instead of clinging to past glories." The exchange revealed the philosophical divide that separated them more completely than physical distance or tactical opposition. Takakota had embraced assimilation as survival strategy, while Nashoba maintained cultural identity despite the costs. Their duel was interrupted when Elise emerged from concealment to engage enemies who had reached the defensive perimeter. Her movement drew rifle fire that forced Noba to shift position, breaking his established firing pattern and creating opportunities for Dakota to advance. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as the attackers pressed their numerical advantage. Dr. Cobb was treating a wounded Helen Martinez while continuing to provide covering fire, while Ricardo had been forced to abandon his position when attackers flanked his wall. But ammunition was running critically low, and the defender positions were being systematically eliminated by concentrated fire. Within minutes, they would be overrun unless something changed the tactical balance dramatically. That change came when Takakota, advancing through the ruins toward Nashoba's position, encountered Elise at close range. For a moment, they faced each other across a few yards of broken ground, her small pistol against his military rifle. "You're the surveyor's daughter," he said, recognition dawning in his weathered features. "I'm the woman who's going to destroy everything Hale built," she replied, her voice steady despite the deadly situation. But instead of firing immediately, Takakota hesitated a moment's reluctance that spoke of someone struggling with orders that went against fundamental values. That hesitation cost him the initiative, as Elise's training with the wolves had taught her to recognize and exploit such moments of uncertainty. Her shot was fired at point-blank range, the heavy .44 caliber bullet taking him in the chest and spinning him to the ground among the ruins. But even as he fell, his rifle discharged in a reflexive trigger pull that sent its bullet toward Nashoba's position. The shot was unsteady and poorly aimed, but at close range, even bad shooting could be fatal. The bullet struck Nashoba in the left shoulder, the impact spinning him around and sending his Spencer carbine flying across the rocky ground. Elise reached him first, her field experience with the wolves having taught her basic medical treatment for traumatic injuries. She used strips torn from her clothing to create pressure bandages, while Dr. Cobb finished dealing with Helen's wound and moved to provide professional care. As the surviving attackers withdrew in disorder, their command structure broken and their tactical advantage lost, Nashoba found himself looking toward where his brother lay, motionless among the stones. The child who'd laughed at winter fires and woven grass into toy animals was finally at peace. But the cost of that peace would haunt his dreams for years to come. "How bad?" he asked Dr. Cobb, forcing himself to focus on present needs rather than past regrets. "Bad enough," the doctor replied honestly. "But you'll live and you'll heal. The question is whether you can live with what you've had to do." Around them, the battlefield grew quiet as the morning sun climbed higher, warming the stones that had witnessed the final act of a tragedy that began 24 years earlier with a starving child's desperate choices. The recovery period stretched through 2 weeks of careful medical treatment and gradual restoration of strength conducted in the relative safety of Dr. Cobb's clinic in the town of Esperanza. The small community had declared itself neutral in territorial political conflicts, maintaining that neutrality through a combination of geographic isolation and armed preparedness. But physical healing was only part of the recovery process. The emotional aftermath of his brother's death required a different kind of treatment that no medical training could provide. Nashoba spent long hours in contemplation, working through feelings of guilt, relief, and loss that had no simple resolution. Elise remained at his side throughout the recovery, their shared experiences having forged bonds that went deeper than romantic attraction. They'd saved each other's lives multiple times, shared resources when survival was uncertain, and faced death together with courage that neither could have summoned alone. Their relationship had evolved beyond desperate partnership into something more substantial and enduring. They talked about the future with increasing confidence, making plans that assumed they would face whatever challenges arose as a permanent team rather than temporary allies. The most significant development was the arrival of Federal Marshal William Harrison, accompanied by 2 deputies and explicit orders from Washington to investigate territorial land fraud and political corruption. News of their evidence had finally reached honest authorities with the power and determination to act decisively. Marshal Harrison examined Whitmore's survey documentation with trained eyes, asking pointed questions that demonstrated his understanding of both legal evidence and criminal conspiracy. "This is enough to bring down Hale's entire network," he confirmed after studying the notebooks and supporting testimony fraud, bribery, conspiracy to commit murder, and systematic violation of federal land laws. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough, conducted with federal authority that transcended local political influence. Hale himself was arrested at his ranch headquarters, along with dozens of associates who'd participated in the conspiracy at various levels. Most satisfying was the reversal of fraudulent land transfers that had dispossessed legitimate homesteaders and ranchers. Families who'd been driven from their property by legal manipulation and violence were able to reclaim their holdings and resume building sustainable communities. But the most significant change was in Nashoba and Elise themselves, who found their relationship deepening into permanent commitment as they worked together on reconstruction projects. Their complementary skills made them effective partners in multiple endeavors. They were married in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with territorial legal requirements conducted by Marshal Harrison in his capacity as a federal official. The wedding was attended by everyone who'd participated in their struggle, creating bonds of community that extended beyond individual relationships. The wolves participated in the ceremony with typical dignity, their presence symbolizing the kind of cooperation that had made survival possible during the darkest phases of their struggle. Local children had learned to communicate with the pack through simple signals, creating relationships that would benefit both species for years to come. 6 months after the final confrontation, the transformed landscape of the Esperanza Valley reflected the dramatic changes that had followed the collapse of Hale's conspiracy. Small farms and ranches flourished under legitimate ownership, while cooperative ventures allowed families to share resources and reduce individual risk. Nashoba had established himself as a liaison between Apache bands and the territorial government, using his cultural knowledge and growing political influence to negotiate agreements that respected traditional rights while accommodating the reality of American expansion. Elise had founded a surveying and mapping business that provided technical services to homesteaders while maintaining the high standards of accuracy and integrity that had characterized her father's work. Their marriage had produced the kind of partnership that multiplied individual strengths while minimizing personal weaknesses. They worked together on projects that required both technical expertise and cultural sensitivity, creating solutions that might have been impossible for either to achieve independently. The wolves had established permanent territory around their homestead, but they maintained their independence and natural behaviors while serving as informal guardians for the extended community. On a warm evening in late spring, as Nashoba and Elise sat outside their cabin, watching the wolves teach their cubs to hunt, Marshal Harrison arrived with final news about the conspiracy they'd fought. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, accepting coffee and settling into a chair on their porch. "We found Hale's private records in a hidden safe at his ranch, documents that show the full scope of what he was planning." The marshal opened a leather portfolio filled with correspondence and financial records that revealed ambitions far beyond simple territorial land fraud. Hale had been coordinating with similar organizations in other territories, planning a network of political corruption that would have influenced statehood proceedings across the entire American West. But there was one final revelation that completed their understanding of the personal dimensions of their struggle. Among Hale's papers was correspondence with David Rowan that revealed the true nature of his recruitment and service. "Your brother wasn't just a hired gun," Harrison said quietly. "He was being blackmailed." Hale had evidence that David was involved in attacks on Apache camps that included children, and he used that evidence to force continued cooperation. The letters showed a man trapped between impossible choices: continued service to enemies of his people, or exposure of war crimes that would result in imprisonment or execution. Lakota had chosen the path that seemed to offer survival, but it had led ultimately to moral degradation and death at the hands of his own family. "He tried to quit several times," Harrison continued, "but Hale always pulled him back with threats and promises. By the end, I think he wanted to die rather than continue serving the conspiracy." The revelation transformed Noba's understanding of his brother's choices and his own role in the final confrontation. Takakota hadn't been a willing traitor, but a victim of circumstances that offered no honorable alternatives. "He could have told me," Nashoba said finally during that last fight. "He could have explained pride." Elise replied, understanding the psychological dynamics that had prevented such revelation. He couldn't admit to his brother that he'd been forced to betray everything they'd both been raised to value. As Marshal Harrison prepared to leave, he paused to offer a final observation about the changes that had transformed the valley. "What you've built here," he said, gesturing toward the scattered lights of the cooperative community that had grown around Esperanza. "This is what the territory was supposed to become. Honest families working together, different cultures, finding common ground law, serving justice instead of profit." After he departed, Nashoba and Elise remained on their porch as stars appeared in the clear mountain air. The sounds of the night carried voices of children, playing families calling to each other across the distances that separated homesteads, and the distant howling of wild wolves acknowledging their domesticated cousins. "Any regrets?" Elise asked, echoing a conversation they'd had during the darkest days of their flight. "Only that it took so much violence to create something peaceful," Nashoba replied. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of a community that had found its own sustainable rhythm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would face them as partners, supported by neighbors who understood the value of cooperation over competition. The notebook that had started their desperate flight now rested in federal archives, its documentation serving as evidence in ongoing prosecutions and historical record of systematic corruption overcome by individual courage and community solidarity. But the real victory wasn't preserved in legal documents. It lived in the relationships between people who chosen cooperation over conflict and children who would grow up expecting justice rather than accepting exploitation, and in the daily evidence that different cultures and species could create something better together than any could achieve alone. The wolves had never obeyed her voice through training or dominance. They'd chosen partnership because it served their interests and honored their intelligence. In the end, that choice had saved not just their own lives, but the future of